Algeria's hostage crisis comes to a bloody end. Troops launched a final assault on the armed group on Saturday. 32 gunmen are killed and at least 23 hostages, but that figure could rise. Now critics are asking how the attackers were able to overrun the desert gas facility and why. Hello there, I'm Shiulie Ghosh, you're with Inside Story. It was a 4-day standoff that ended suddenly and violently. Around 40 heavily armed fighters took hundreds of Algerians and expatriates hostage at a remote gas plant in the desert and demanded an end to the French military operation in neighbouring Mali. The sprawling complex of In Amenas became the focus of a bloody battle, and the message from Algerian forces was clear: we don't negotiate. Here's how events unfolded. January the 16th, heavily armed gunmen attacked 2 buses carrying gas field workers at the In Amenas plant in the Sahara Desert. An Al-Qaeda offshoot calling itself the Signed in Blood Battalion was said to be behind the assault. Barely 24 hours later, Algerian forces launched an attack as gunmen tried to move the hostages. Western leaders were angry they hadn't been consulted. 2 hostages were reported killed, while others escaped. January the 18th, and a tense standoff unfolds with the fate of many hostages unknown. On Saturday, Algerian special forces stormed the complex. 7 hostages were killed by their captors. 685 Algerian workers and 107 foreigners were freed. Let's speak to my guests now from Rabat in Morocco. Bill Lawrence, North Africa Project Director for the International Crisis Group. Here in Doha, Sylvain Touati, Associate Fellow at FIKRA Consulting and Research, a think tank here in Qatar. Sylvain is also Associate Fellow at the French Institute for International Relations. And in our London studios, Dr. Mamdouh Salameh, an international oil economist and consultant to the World Bank on oil and energy. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Bill, if I can start with you, tell us a bit about this group, the Signed in Blood Battalion. Now, this is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and it's led by Mokhtar Belmokhtar. What do we know about him and about the group?
Well, as I understand it, Mokhtar Ben Mokhtar formed in fall of 2012 this offshoot you're talking about, which is actually called the Masked Brigade. And the group that carried out the actual attack is called the Signatories in Blood faction of that brigade. There are fighters of some 6 nationalities, according to Algerian sources. And it's led by someone from Niger, as we understand it, Nigeri. And he came up with a group from Niger of fighters. Apparently the vehicles had Malian and Libyan license plates. So we're talking about attackers that were multinational, just like the hostages were multinational.
But based in Mali, and that is why we think they were demanding an end to the French military operation in Mali.
That's correct. Mokhtar Ben Mokhtar has long been in Mali. Of course, he's done operations, jihadist operations all over the Sahara and Sahel region. He used to be the Saharan commander for the Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb group, AQIM. And he's currently believed to be based in Mali and part of this holding of northern Malian territory. And the job of this operation was to internationalize the Malian conflict further and push it into Algeria.
Sylvain, it's a fact, isn't it, that many of the rebel groups in Mali have very strong links to Algeria. In fact, many of the fighters that we find in northern Mali actually came from Algeria.
Yes, I believe that's the origin of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. It was a former group for the combat and predication Salafist group, which was a group led by Algerians, militant and activists during the civil war. And yes, they went down south from Algeria, and they've been active in northern Mali since 2005-2006. It's not a new group. The activities have been in the region for quite a while. They were the one behind the kidnapping of French hostages in the Areva mining site a few years back. They've been taking hostage in all over the region, and they've also been active in Algeria. It's not a new thing for southern Algeria. You have to remember that a couple of years ago, Janet Airport, which is one of the main airports in southern Algeria, was attacked by also a activist group in the region. So yes, the scale of this attack is really huge, and it's really taken by surprise many experts in the region. But this group have been active for almost 10 years now in the region.
And the man who's believed to have planned the attack, he wasn't part of the attackers, but he's thought to have planned it. Mokhtar Belmokhtar, he's actually been wanted by French counter-terrorism forces for quite a while.
Not only by French, I think when we're talking about Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, most of the security services in the world are trying to get hold of these people. Yes, Mokhtar Belmokhtar has been very active. He's not only active in hostage kidnapping, he was also active in drug trafficking, in cigarette trafficking. He's notoriously known in the region for being Mr. Marlboro, because he was taking his cut in the cigarette traffic. So Mokhtar Belmokhtar is also even have a blur reputation even amongst Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and that's why we heard that he created his own brigades. He had a feud within Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb with other leaders, and that's why he created his own brigade. And that's something that's what we know. You know, it's very difficult to find out information about what's happening inside these groups, but we heard about some sources that Mokhtar Belmokhtar is still in northern Mali.
Okay, Mamdouh, given that there are these groups in this particular region and that there is instability in this region, should the In Amenas gas facility have been better protected?
Well, in hindsight, yes, but no country, especially an oil and gas producer, can protect all the installations in the case of Algeria, which are spread all over the country. Algeria is a huge country, and the oil and gas installations are spread all over the country, particularly in the eastern and southern part of the country. So no army or no government can protect every installation. However, the government should always be on the alert to see whether there is tension. With the Mali rebellion, they should have been more prepared to protect isolated installations like the gas installation, which was involved in the trouble.
Yeah, that's a good point, because obviously there's discussion about whether Mali was the main motivation for this group, but it is a fact that the oil and gas industry itself is also increasingly becoming a target for groups like this.
Of course. The question is, Algeria depends on 97% of its export revenues come from oil and gas. Consequently, if you want to harm the Algerian economy, you attack its oil and gas installations if you can. And with that in mind, the government should be more careful to protect these installations. And of course, the terrorists will make a point of attacking where it hurts Algeria most.
Okay, well, just while we're on that subject, let's take a look at the oil and gas statistics. They are, of course, the mainstay of Algeria's economy. Yet gunmen were able to move into the In Amenas plant and surprise hundreds of local and foreign staff. Now, the industry accounts for 98% of Algeria's exports, valued at some $63 billion, and it generates 70% of tax revenues. Algeria is the third largest supplier of gas to the European Union, and the In Amenas plant is one of Algeria's most productive, accounting for 15% of gas exports. Mamdouh, it's surely going to be some time before oil companies feel that they can safely return their workers to Algeria, given what's happened.
They will return eventually. I mean, these events will be forgotten in time, and the international oil companies are very interested in the oil and gas potential of Algeria. A lot of oil and a lot of gas is being discovered. Consequently, they cannot ignore the potential of Algeria. However, they will be hesitant for a short while, but then they will come back to Algeria. We have to remember that in the 90s, the Algerian armed forces fought very savage battles with the Islamists, but they made a point to protect the oil and gas installations.
But Bill, I wanted to ask you, I mean, when Mamdouh makes the point that the Algerian forces did fight the Islamists in very violent, very bloody battles back in the 90s, but isn't that the reason why you've now got most of these groups, that because they formed armed groups because they were targeted so violently by the Algerian forces?
Yes, I mean, what happened was Algeria waged a very bloody battle with these types of groups starting in 1992 and in some ways right through to the present. I mean, in 2002, Algeria sort of declared victory from the Black Decade and said they were moving on, but you had upwards of 400 or 500 civilians per year, some 60 attacks last year from such groups in Algeria. So in some ways, the war never ended in Algeria. It just became much more low intensity, and these groups were effectively pushed back by Algerian security forces out of Algeria at times to the extreme southern areas in Algeria, and of course into the other neighboring countries.
Sylvain, so are the attacks that we've seen recently in Algeria, is that a legacy of Algeria's so-called dirty war in the 90s?
Definitely, it's one legacy. As the previous guest mentioned, you still have very active group, even if Algerian authorities try to brand the country as safe and as a place where investors can are welcome and can invest freely. We've seen very bloody attack in the recent year. We have the attack against the UN offices in Algiers. You had other attack against governmental offices, buildings. You have also workers, international workers who have been targeted in the recent years. So yes, it's a legacy of the previous, of the civil conflict in the 1990s. And what we have to remember is if most of the militant, of the Islamist militant who were active during the war decided to agree for pacification in Algeria, the one who stayed in the maquis, in the mountain or in the southern, in the desert, are the ones that are the hardcore ones, are the ones that didn't accept the peace, and are the ones that really believed in their cause and the fact that they want to really impose their agenda to the country. And they even been continuing even when most of us as supporters have been going for peace, and that is really important. When you have a determined group, well-trained, well-financed, it's really difficult to fight against them. I know that probably you have security breaches in Amenas during the last operation, but you have to remember that when you have determined combatants, it's really, really difficult to stop them.
Let's just have a look at the attitude of the Algerian authorities during this. Even as the crisis was unfolding on Wednesday, the Algerian communications minister made the position clear that there would be no negotiation with armed groups. We say that in the face of terrorism, yesterday, as today, as tomorrow, there will be no negotiation, no blackmail, no respite. Those who think we will negotiate with terrorists are delusional. Sylvain, I suppose that attitude is not really a surprise, given that I think most governments would say that they will not negotiate with those they consider terrorists. It's interesting because Mokhtar Belmokhtar has said that he is ready to negotiate with Algeria, but clearly Algeria is not going to negotiate with him. Yes,
definitely. Of course, when Algeria says they never negotiate, you have to remember that in 1999, 1997, they were negotiating with groups that they were not supposed to negotiate with. So, of course, if there is a ground for negotiation, I think the Algerian government will at least study it. But when you have a group like leading an operation that we've seen in the recent days, it has been the stand of Algerian authorities and Algerian security services, because you have to remember and keep in mind that Algerian state has also a lot of internal feud at the moment, and not all the services and not all the politicians have the same approach towards Islamism and radical groups. And you have different positions within the Algerian government and Algerian political class. And that's something that we need to keep in mind. The situation, you don't have like one stand against terrorism. You have different approach, and even this statement by the communication minister, in the fact we can maybe see some evolution in the coming weeks. And you have to keep in mind as well that a lot of a lot of countries, especially France and the US, were a little bit surprised by the position of Algeria about the situation in northern Mali, and many experts were thinking that Algeria was happy to keep the problem outside of its border. And I think some of the secret service, or at least security services within Algeria, maybe forgotten and thought that they could control the threat against Algeria. And this situation in the recent days shows that it's very difficult to control a situation like that.
Bill, it is a case that Algeria allowed France to use its airspace in order to launch strikes against northern Mali, which is interesting in itself that it's cooperating with its former sort of colonial power. Is that going to come back and bite Algeria in the future? I mean, could we see more attacks on Algeria because of that connection and the overspill from what's happening in northern Mali?
Well, it's already bitten France and Algeria. But I think the most interesting aspect of all this is of the some 15 or 20 countries that are involved in the Malian conflict. At the beginning of this Malian conflict, France was at one end of the spectrum of the debate, and Algeria was at the other end of the spectrum. Algeria had taken a position not unlike its position on the Libyan conflict, where it was warning of all kinds of instability that would grow out of such of a conflict. And one of the most interesting things of what's happened over the last week is that France and Algeria's positions have converged, and there's this new international coalition that's forming that wants to solve North Africa's problems with a security response. And our main concern is that a security-only response, as the Algerians were saying, and even though they exercised a lot of muscle in their security response to the hostage crisis, isn't the best way to go. There's a more important political piece, there's a humanitarian piece, there's a lot that needs to go on in Mali, there's things that still need to go on in Algeria and in the neighboring countries to address the full range of problems that are issues that are causing this. And a security-only response, the way we're hearing from some of the capitals in Europe, is not going to succeed.
Mamdouh, I wonder what view the oil industry and investors take on this, because it is the case, isn't it, that political events have impacted quite widely on the oil industry in recent years.
It did, but we must, as I pointed out, Algeria has a huge potential for oil and gas production. So although these events will deter for a short period of time investors and foreign workers to come to Algeria, it will not stop them forever, because investors are always looking for a new market to explore for oil and for gas. And Algeria is the 8th biggest gas producer, and of course it is number 14 in terms of its proven oil reserves.
Won't investors in oil companies want reassurances from the Algerian government that it's able to protect their workers? Because, I mean, for example, Western governments were very angry and surprised when the Algerian special forces went in 24 hours in a surprise raid, and some of the hostages ended up dead from that, and they hadn't consulted Western governments. Won't oil companies and investors take the view that, you know, they need assurances that their people will be properly protected and looked after, and there will be a proper response should something like this happen again?
You are absolutely right. Of course, investors and foreign governments will ask for tougher measures by the Algerian government to protect foreign workers there and to protect the investment as well. And of course, these investors are looking for the Algerian government to reduce the level of bureaucracy and to eliminate the windfall tax, which led the American oil company Anadarko to take Algerian government to court, and eventually they settled the problem. But the windfall tax is one factor. There is the bureaucracy, and there is the protection of workers and investment. So I am sure the Algerian government will have to look with clear eyes and ears to what the investors want. Otherwise, they will be in trouble again in the future.
Okay. We've had some quite interesting reaction to this whole issue on our Facebook page. Let's have a quick look at some of these messages. Raider Zhao says, stop blaming Algeria. It did what every country would do when attacked by terrorists. Rashid Khan says, taking civilian life for political agendas is shameful and immoral. Whether it's rebel or government, it should be strongly condemned by the world. And Javid Khan says, Algeria was quick to ambush the kidnappers but didn't ask why they did it. Maybe they had a good reason. I don't find it pleasing to get bombed from the sky by other countries. He's clearly referring to the French action in Mali there. Sylvain, is there a feeling that the action by France in Mali now has potentially destabilising consequences for the whole of that region?
I think you need to take the problem in the other direction. He has been a destabilizing factor for almost 7 years. France intervening is only been active for at least a month. We have to remember that the international community let a full region the size of France and Belgium together in the end of terrorist group. I think the international community needs to ask itself about this reaction. We've seen this situation coming. Experts have been saying since 2004, 2005 that this region is destabilized by the action of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and other groups. I think you need to really put the situation in order first. This situation is a spillover of the Algerian civil war. Then it became a crisis in northern Mali and also in Mauritania and Nigeria. You have to remember that all the countries in the region have been under the threat and under attack by this kind of group. You had attack in Morocco, you had attack in Niger, in Libya, in Mali and in Mauritania. All the region is concerned about this issue. And it's not only about France intervention. We were talking about ECOWAS intervention. France intervened, did almost, I think we can blame France for many things in Africa, for many interventions. But one thing from my perspective is François Hollande did everything to not have France intervene in Mali. And I think even the French intervention has been very late compared to the scale of the problem there.
One journalist, Robert Fisk, who is a journalist with the Independent newspaper, has written that the deaths of both captives and captors in this operation was utterly predictable because the Algerian military doesn't give two hoots for the hostages. What do you think about that?
I've read the piece by Robert Fisk and I understand where he's coming from, and I predict there's going to be a lot of recycling of criticism of how Algeria behaved in the 1990s to the present. But it's important to note, getting back to your earlier question about negotiations and lack thereof, that Algeria and France and the US and the UK all made the same point that there's no negotiation with terrorists, when in fact there were discussions going on, and Ben Mokhtar, you have to remember, has been earning a lot of money for many years now, being paid ransoms for such kidnapping. Now, in this particular case, many people said it was a suicide mission. There was so much security in the area that whoever was going to go in wasn't going to come out. And we do have evidence of groups of 5 being shot really early on, and these burnt bodies that were found. So there's no question that this action was different from previous actions in that the militants were more violent than usual up front, and the chance of negotiations were less. And I think as the story unfolds, we're going to hear more and more about why Algeria did what it did.
Okay.
But that said, if we have 40 hostages killed, something went wrong. And there's going to be a lot of, I think, spinning of the story, and we have to be careful if we're to talk about what's actually going on and not just sort of criticizing approaches that may or may not have been relevant to a particular situation.
Good point, Bill. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all my guests today, Bill Lawrence, Sylvain Touati and Mamdouh Salameh. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to contact us, the email, as ever, insidestory at aljazeera.net. Until next time, from me, bye for now.